The courtroom in downtown Pittsburgh was a monument to institutional coldness. High ceilings painted institutional beige loomed overhead, and the morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Every surface seemed designed to intimidate. The massive judge's bench elevated like a throne, the witness stand positioned to expose vulnerability, the gallery benches arranged to make observers feel like vultures circling prey. Judge Patricia Morrison sat at the apex of this architectural hierarchy, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her reputation for uncompromising fairness. She had presided over custody cases for 23 years, and her track record was impeccable. When Judge Morrison made a decision, appellate courts rarely overturned it because she was meticulous, thoughtful, and utterly unmoved by performance or manipulation. This morning's case had already consumed 6 weeks of preliminary hearings, psychological evaluations, and depositions. The file on Judge Morrison's desk was 3 inches thick, filled with documentation of neglect, domestic disturbances, emergency room visits, and police reports. Yet despite all this paper evidence, the most crucial witness, 3-year-old Maya Elizabeth Thompson, sat silently in a specially constructed child-sized chair, unable or unwilling to speak a single word to anyone about what she had witnessed and experienced. Maya was a delicate child, almost ethereal in appearance. Her blonde hair, the exact shade of her mother's, had been meticulously braided that morning by Sarah Thompson, Maya's mother, who'd spent an extra 20 minutes on the styling, desperately hoping that her daughter would feel safe and confident. The braids were decorated with small pink ribbons, and Maya wore a pale lavender dress that had been specially chosen, not too babyish, but clearly age-appropriate, designed to present her as innocent but not pitiable. Sarah had learned that courtrooms were performances, and every detail mattered. For the past 8 months, since the day a mandatory reporter had discovered the conditions in their apartment and called Child Protective Services, Maya hadn't uttered a single word, not a whisper, not a cry, not even a laugh or a scream. She communicated through gestures, through pointing, through nodding or shaking her head, but her voice had seemingly vanished completely. Child psychologists called it selective mutism, a condition where a child develops the ability to speak, but consciously or unconsciously chooses not to in specific situations, usually triggered by severe anxiety or trauma. Dr. Meredith Chen, the child psychologist assigned to Maya's case, had visited twice weekly for the entire 8 months. She tried every technique in her professional arsenal: play therapy, art therapy, animal therapy, music therapy. She'd used puppets, dolls, picture cards, and gentle questioning. She'd consulted with colleagues, reviewed case studies, and even brought in a colleague who specialized in severely traumatized children. Nothing had worked. During their sessions, Maya would participate in activities, would draw pictures that revealed troubling imagery, stick figures with scribbled-out faces, dark clouds, and what appeared to be distressed animals. But she refused to verbalize any explanation or emotion. The silence had become almost physically present, like a wall constructed brick by brick between Maya and the world. Across the courtroom, Derek Thompson sat with his legal team. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, with the kind of easy charm that had first attracted Sarah years ago, before the drinking started, before the anger transformed him into someone she barely recognized. Derek wore an expensive suit, navy blue with a white shirt and burgundy tie, clearly selected by his high-priced defense attorney to present an image of respectability and reform. His lawyer, Harrison Blackwell, was renowned for his success in custody cases. He'd won 87% of his cases, a record he advertised prominently on his downtown office. Blackwell believed that this case was winnable, and his confidence radiated through the courtroom like heat from a furnace. The reality of Derek's situation was this: he wanted custody not out of love for his daughter, but out of spite toward Sarah. She had finally found the courage to leave him, to take Maya and flee to her mother's house in the suburbs. She'd filed for divorce and full custody simultaneously. Derek's pride had been wounded, his control threatened. In his mind, losing Maya was losing a possession, a trophy, a way to maintain leverage over his ex-wife. He'd hired the best lawyer money could buy and embarked on a carefully orchestrated campaign of rehabilitation. The anger management classes, the AA meetings, the character witnesses, the therapist's recommendation letter he'd paid for. Sarah sat to the left of her legal representative, Margaret DeLuca, a competent but understaffed public defender who was managing this case among 15 others. Sarah's suit was off the rack, purchased at a department store sale. Her hands trembled as she watched her daughter sit frozen in that chair. She wanted to cry out, to run to Maya and hold her, to explain to her that everything would be okay. But she knew that any emotional display would be used against her, painted as instability or manipulation by Derek's team. The gallery was filled with observers. Maya's maternal grandmother sat in the front row, her face a mask of concern and barely contained anger. Social workers took notes. A court-appointed child advocate sat nearby, tasked with representing Maya's best interests independent of either parent. 2 journalists from local news outlets sat near the back, having picked up on the story's human interest angle. This case had everything: a traumatized child, accusations of domestic violence, a custody battle, and the central mystery of why the child had stopped speaking. Judge Morrison surveyed the room, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. She'd seen custody battles before where one parent was clearly toxic and the other protective. She'd also seen cases where both parents were reasonably decent but simply incompatible. This case, however, had a darkness to it: documented abuse, a child's complete psychological shutdown, and a father who seemed far too confident despite the evidence arrayed against him. As the judge prepared to begin proceedings, the courtroom doors opened one final time. Officer James Chen entered, leading a golden retriever on a leash. The dog wore an official K-9 unit vest and had the calm demeanor of an animal specifically trained for therapeutic work. Her name was Bella, and she was about to become the most important participant in this entire proceeding, though nobody in that courtroom, except perhaps the dog herself, could have anticipated the magnitude of her impact. The judge had authorized Bella's presence as a comfort measure, a last resort of sorts, acknowledging that traditional court procedures often traumatize children further rather than helping them communicate. Most people in the courtroom considered it a desperate gesture, a Hail Mary pass in legal terms. But as Bella entered and took her position on a designated mat near the child's chair, something shifted in the atmospheric pressure of the room. The dog's presence seemed to soften the institutional coldness, to inject a note of possibility into an otherwise grim proceeding. Maya's eyes lifted slightly at the sound of Bella's collar jingling. For the first time that morning, her rigid posture relaxed, just fractionally, but enough that her mother noticed and felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. The stage was set, the players were assembled, and nobody, not Judge Morrison, not Derek Thompson, not Sarah, not even Officer Chen, had any idea that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The courtroom settled into an expectant silence as Judge Morrison adjusted her glasses and opened the case file before her. The morning had arrived with gray skies and the promise of rain, fitting weather for a proceeding that would determine the future of a small child's life. Morrison was not one for theatrics or sentiment. She believed in facts, evidence, and the careful application of the law. Yet even she could feel the weight of this particular case pressing down on the room like a physical force. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, though technically they had already begun preliminary proceedings hours earlier. What was about to unfold was the decisive phase, the moment where testimonies would be given, cross-examinations would occur, and the judge would begin forming her ultimate judgment about Maya's custody and safety. Derek Thompson's lawyer, Harrison Blackwell, stood first. He was a tall man with silver streaks in his dark hair, the kind of appearance that suggested trustworthiness and authority. He'd practiced his opening statement hundreds of times, refining every inflection, every gesture. He began with a story, not about Derek's failings, but about redemption, about second chances, about a man who had recognized his mistakes and worked tirelessly to correct them. "Your Honor," Blackwell began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "we are here today not to relitigate the past, but to address the present and future. Yes, Mr. Thompson had difficulties. Yes, there were moments in his marriage when alcohol and anger played unfortunate roles. But I stand before you to present a man transformed, a man who has taken responsibility, a man who deserves the opportunity to be the father his daughter needs." The words hung in the air, seductive in their simplicity. Blackwell was masterful at this, at reframing narrative, at making accountability sound like virtue, at turning weakness into strength through the alchemy of sophisticated language. He continued, "The evidence you will hear today includes Mr. Thompson's completion of an intensive 12-week anger management program at the Allegheny Institute. You will hear from his therapist, Dr. Richard Paulson, who can attest to genuine psychological growth. You will hear from his sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous, who can verify 14 months of continuous sobriety. And you will hear character witnesses, business associates, family members, clergy, who can speak to the positive changes they have observed." Margaret DeLuca, Sarah's public defender, sat rigidly in her chair, her jaw clenched. She wanted to object, to point out that Blackwell was engaging in narrative manipulation, that completion of programs meant nothing if the underlying rage remained untreated. But objecting now would seem desperate, reactive. Better to wait for cross-examination, to pick holes in Derek's testimony when he took the stand. Derek himself sat with an expression of carefully calibrated remorse. He wore his sobriety like a suit. It fit him well, at least superficially. He'd practiced his testimony with Blackwell for weeks, learning which parts of his story to emphasize, which painful admissions would seem most authentic, which moments of apparent vulnerability would resonate with the judge. "The child in question," Blackwell continued, gesturing toward Maya with the kind of paternal concern that made Sarah's skin crawl, "has experienced a traumatic separation from her father. While we understand that certain protective measures were necessary given the circumstances at the time, we must consider whether continued estrangement serves her best interests. Children need both parents. Children need stability. Children need to know that their fathers love them." The gallery murmured slightly. Some people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. The journalist scribbled notes furiously, recognizing that this was powerful material, a redemption narrative, a story of a flawed man attempting to reclaim his place in his daughter's life. When Derek took the witness stand, he was composed and articulate. Blackwell guided him through his testimony with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. "Mr. Thompson," Blackwell asked, "can you describe for the court what led to the incident that prompted the Child Protective Service's intervention?" Derek paused as if the memory pained him deeply. "I was struggling," he began, his voice measured and reflective. "I'd been drinking too much. My marriage was falling apart. I said things I regret, did things I'm not proud of, but I want to be clear, I never touched my daughter in anger, I never physically harmed her. I made mistakes as a parent, yes. I allowed my personal struggles to affect my family, but I've learned from that, I've grown from it." He spoke about his therapy sessions, about the insights he'd gained, about the pain of being separated from his daughter. He expressed remorse with just the right amount of emotion, not so much as to seem manipulative, but enough to appear genuinely affected. He painted a picture of a flawed man who had recognized his flaws and was working diligently to correct them. "I love my daughter," he concluded, his eyes glistening with what appeared to be genuine tears. "All I want is the opportunity to be the man she deserves, the father she needs. I understand that it will take time to rebuild trust. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." It was a masterclass in courtroom persuasion. Several people in the gallery seemed moved. The judge's expression remained neutral, but Derek's team felt confident. They had set the narrative, a man in recovery deserving of a second chance. Then Margaret DeLuca stood for cross-examination. She was competent but operating on a shoestring budget and an enormous caseload. She tried to challenge Derek's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies in the timeline, questioning the depth of his therapeutic work, suggesting that his completion of programs might be performative rather than genuinely transformative. "Mr. Thompson," she asked pointedly, "when you say you never physically harmed your daughter, are you suggesting that psychological abuse, yelling, intimidating behavior, creating an atmosphere of fear, that such things didn't occur?" Derek hesitated, then recovered smoothly. "I was an angry person. I've acknowledged that. But I was not abusive toward my child. I lost my temper with my wife sometimes, yes, but Maya was never the target of my anger." "Weren't you, in fact, arrested for disturbing the peace on 3 separate occasions during the marriage?" DeLuca pressed. "Those incidents were years ago," Derek replied calmly. "Before my current recovery program. I've explained the context." "And didn't those incidents occur while your daughter was in the home?" "Technically, yes, but—" "Just a yes or no answer, Mr. Thompson." "Yes." But the damage was minimal. Blackwell had already inoculated the judge against this line of questioning by presenting Derek's past as ancient history before his transformation. The narrative was set. Yes, there had been problems, but they had been addressed through professional intervention and genuine commitment to change. During a brief recess, Sarah sat with her mother and Margaret DeLuca, feeling a creeping sense of despair. Without Maya's testimony, without her voice corroborating what her mother had witnessed, it became Sarah's word against Derek's reformed persona. Derek had documentation of his programs, professional letters of recommendation, character witnesses prepared to testify. What did Sarah have? A frightened child who wouldn't speak, and her own testimony about domestic disturbances that Derek could, and did, characterize as exaggerations born of a bitter divorce. Margaret DeLuca patted Sarah's arm, offering reassurance she didn't entirely feel. "We still have our case to present," she said. "We have the social workers, the medical evidence, the documentation." But both women knew the truth. Without Maya's voice, without the child's own account of what she had witnessed, they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Derek's team had figured out what many attorneys instinctively understood, that a silent child was a child whose testimony could not contradict a carefully constructed narrative of redemption and recovery. Maya remained silent throughout all of this, still sitting in her small chair, still staring at nothing in particular. But occasionally, her eyes would drift toward the mat where Bella lay, watching the proceedings with the kind of patient understanding that seemed almost supernatural. The afternoon sun had shifted in the sky, casting different shadows across the courtroom floor. Judge Morrison called for a brief lunch recess, but the atmosphere had fundamentally altered. Derek's testimony had been effective, perhaps devastatingly so. The judge had listened carefully, occasionally making notes, her expression betraying nothing. But those who understood courtroom dynamics could sense a subtle shift, a loosening of the tension that had pervaded the morning session, a slight inclination toward Derek's narrative of redemption. When court reconvened at 1 o'clock, Margaret DeLuca called her first witness, Dr. Meredith Chen, the child psychologist who had been working with Maya for 8 months. Dr. Chen was a woman in her 50s, with an air of quiet competence and genuine concern for her young patient. She had spent countless hours trying to unlock whatever mechanism had caused Maya to retreat into silence, and she carried the weight of that failure, or perhaps the weight of a mystery she couldn't solve. DeLuca guided her through the initial questions. "Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, what is the underlying cause of Maya's selective mutism?" Dr. Chen considered the question carefully. "Selective mutism is typically triggered by severe anxiety or trauma," she explained, her voice clear and measured. "In Maya's case, Given the documented domestic disturbances in the home, the emergency room visits by her mother with injuries consistent with domestic violence, and the conditions in which they were found, I believe Maya has experienced psychological trauma significant enough to cause her to shut down verbally as a protective mechanism. Can you elaborate on that? DeLuca prompted. Children sometimes respond to overwhelming situations by freezing, Dr. Chen continued. It's not that they physically cannot speak. It's that their nervous system has entered a state of profound anxiety, and speech becomes impossible. Think of it like a computer shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core operations. Maya's brain has essentially decided that speaking is not safe, so it has disabled that function. It was a compelling explanation, backed by professional expertise and years of experience. Several people in the gallery nodded. Sarah's mother reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. Then Harrison Blackwell stood for cross-examination, and his demeanor shifted into something more aggressive, more calculating. "Dr. Chen," he began, "you've been working with Maya for 8 months, correct?" "Yes, that's correct." "And in those 8 months, despite all your therapeutic interventions, all your professional expertise, Maya still hasn't spoken to you a single word." "That's true, but—" "A simple yes or no, please, doctor. The fact remains that despite your best efforts, you have been unable to help this child communicate, correct?" "Yes, but her silence is itself diagnostic information." "So you've been unsuccessful." Dr. Chen's jaw tightened. "My role is not to force communication, but to create a safe environment where it might occur naturally." "And 8 months later, she still hasn't spoken. Would you agree that a different approach might be warranted? Perhaps one involving the child's father, who is willing to help her rebuild trust?" "I would strongly caution against placing a traumatized child in the care of the person she may perceive as the source of her trauma." "But you don't know that for certain, do you? You don't know what specifically caused her to stop speaking. You've theorized, but you haven't proven anything, have you?" It was masterful cross-examination, turning Dr. Chen's professional limitations into evidence that her assessment might be incorrect. By the time Blackwell finished, he'd managed to cast doubt on the very expertise that supported Sarah's position. The judge made a note in her file, her expression still neutral but her pen moving across the page with particular emphasis. The afternoon wore on with testimony from social workers, each describing the conditions in which Maya and her mother were found, the signs of neglect, the evidence of domestic disturbance. But each could also be cross-examined about whether they had directly witnessed abuse, whether they had actually seen Derek harm anyone, whether their conclusions were based on inference rather than observation. By 4 o'clock, Maya had been sitting in her small chair for nearly 7 hours. Her legs were probably aching. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. She hadn't spoken to anyone. The strain of the day was beginning to show in the slight tremor of her hands, the way her eyes seemed to stare through rather than at anything specific. Judge Morrison noticed this. She was a careful observer of children in custody proceedings, having learned through experience that courtroom processes were inherently traumatic for young people. She had begun to consider whether they should reconvene another day, whether forcing Maya to sit through additional hours of testimony served any purpose. It was then that Officer James Chen, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom throughout the entire proceedings, made a subtle gesture. He leaned over to his supervisor, and within moments, arrangements were being made. Officer Chen approached the bench during a brief pause in testimony. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "I wonder if I might make a suggestion regarding the child's well-being." Judge Morrison looked up, curious. "What would that be, officer?" "Bella has been trained to recognize signs of distress in children," Officer Chen explained. "She's been present in similar proceedings where traumatized children seemed unable to communicate. Sometimes, allowing a child a few moments of direct contact with the dog can help them regulate their nervous system. It might help young Maya remain calm and focused for the remainder of these proceedings. Harrison Blackwell stood immediately. "Your Honor, I object to this. This is clearly an attempt to manipulate the child's emotional state. It's suggestive influence designed to prime her toward the mother's narrative. This is exactly the kind of procedural irregularity that—" But Judge Morrison raised her hand. "I understand your concern, Mr. Blackwell. However, my primary obligation is to the child's well-being. I'm not asking Officer Chen's dog to testify or to perform any therapeutic function that would prejudice your client. I am asking whether a few moments of contact with a calm animal might help settle a clearly distressed child. Surely you cannot object to the basic human compassion of that." Blackwell wanted to continue objecting, but he recognized he was on losing ground. To push further would make him appear cold, unconcerned with the child's welfare. Instead, he sat down, his jaw tight with frustration. "Officer Chen," Judge Morrison continued, "you may allow the child brief contact with your animal. However, let us be clear for the record that this is a measure designed solely to address the child's visible distress and has no bearing whatsoever on the substance of these proceedings." Officer Chen nodded and began to approach Maya's chair with Bella on her leash. The dog, trained for exactly these situations, walked slowly and deliberately, her body language non-threatening, her demeanor calm and professional. Maya watched the dog approach with an intensity that suggested recognition, as if some part of her understood that this animal represented something safe in an otherwise overwhelming environment. Bella lay down on the floor near Maya's chair, close enough for contact but not forcing it. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, her brown eyes warm and patient. For the first time all day, something shifted in Maya's rigid posture. Her shoulders, which had been hunched near her ears, began to relax slightly. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists in her lap, began to open. Sarah watched this small transformation with tears beginning to form in her eyes. She didn't know yet that this moment, this simple introduction between a traumatized child and a trained therapy dog, would alter the course of the entire proceeding. Bella's presence seemed to create a bubble of calm around Maya, a small island of safety in a sea of institutional coldness and adversarial tension. The dog's steadiness was contagious, spreading through the child's nervous system like medicine, like hope, like possibility. Derek watched from his side of the courtroom, his confidence unchanged. He didn't yet understand that the arrival of this dog was the beginning of the unraveling of his carefully constructed narrative. Judge Morrison observed the interaction carefully, making another note in her file. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and her instinct was telling her that something important was about to happen in this courtroom. Bella, it seemed, had a message to deliver, and a silent child was about to find her voice. The courtroom had transformed into something almost sacred. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed softer now, or perhaps it was merely a trick of perception, the collective consciousness of the room shifting toward something gentler, more human. Judge Morrison had called a brief recess, announcing that proceedings would resume in 15 minutes. Most people filed out toward the bathrooms or the hallway, but Sarah remained seated, her eyes never leaving her daughter and the golden dog beside her. Maya's fingers had begun to move tentatively across Bella's fur, exploring the texture with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested she was discovering something profoundly important. The dog remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and deep, her body language communicating absolute acceptance. Officer Chen sat nearby, observing but not interfering, giving the child and the dog space to establish their own connection without adult mediation or direction. Margaret DeLuca sat next to Sarah, watching the interaction with professional interest. She'd seen therapy dogs in courtrooms before, but she'd never witnessed one create such an immediate, visceral shift in a child's demeanor. Whatever had happened to Maya in the past 8 months, whatever internal mechanisms had locked her voice away, was beginning to show signs of loosening. "This is good," DeLuca whispered. "This is really good. Even if it doesn't lead to verbal communication today, the fact that Maya is becoming more regulated, more present, that's significant. The judge is watching. She sees that the child is capable of connection, of responding to environmental factors." Sarah nodded, but her attention remained fixed on her daughter. For months, she'd watched Maya move through the world like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. She'd seen her daughter draw disturbing pictures in therapy sessions, stick figures with red scribbles, dark clouds, animals with X's for eyes. She'd heard the professionals use clinical language to describe what they couldn't actually fix: selective mutism, trauma response, dissociation, anxiety disorder. But what Sarah craved was not clinical terminology. It was her daughter's voice, her laugh, her cries, her questions, all the normal sounds of childhood that had been stolen away. Across the courtroom, Derek and Harrison Blackwell conferred in hushed tones. Derek's earlier confidence had begun to crack slightly, though he tried to hide it. "It's just a dog," Blackwell assured him, though his own voice carried less certainty than it had that morning. "It doesn't change the facts. It doesn't provide testimony. It doesn't alter the evidence we've presented." Derek nodded, but doubt was beginning to crystallize in his mind. He'd prepared for this proceeding by crafting a narrative of redemption, by documenting his recovery, by surrounding himself with character witnesses and professional recommendations. What he hadn't prepared for was the possibility that his daughter might find a voice, that she might communicate something that contradicted his carefully constructed story. Dr. Meredith Chen, the child psychologist, stood near the back of the courtroom, observing Maya with the intensity of a researcher watching a crucial experiment unfold. She'd been trained to maintain professional distance, to observe without judgment, but her heart was racing. In her 8 months of work with Maya, she'd tried everything in her therapeutic arsenal without result. She'd created safe spaces. She'd used play therapy and art therapy. She'd been patient and gentle and consistently present. And yet this dog, this animal with no formal training in psychology, no therapeutic degree, no clinical credentials, had achieved in 15 minutes what she had been unable to accomplish in 8 months. There was a lesson in that, she understood. Sometimes human expertise had limitations. Sometimes what a traumatized child needed wasn't analysis or interpretation or professional intervention. Sometimes they needed something simpler: unconditional acceptance, non-judgmental presence, the kind of pure connection that animals could offer in ways humans, for all their sophistication, often could not. The bailiff announced that court would resume in 5 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Would Maya's moment of connection with Bella evaporate the moment the formal proceedings resumed? Would the child retreat back into silence, back into the protective cocoon she'd constructed? When Judge Morrison returned to the bench and everyone had resumed their positions, the judge made an observation that would prove pivotal. She had been watching the courtroom dynamics carefully, and she noticed something that most of the attorneys and professionals in the room had overlooked. "I want to note for the record," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "that the child's visible anxiety levels have decreased noticeably since the introduction of the therapy animal. Her posture is more relaxed. Her hands are no longer clenched. These are measurable physiological changes that indicate improved regulation of her nervous system." Blackwell started to object, but the judge continued. "I understand, Mr. Blackwell, that you believe this is manipulative. However, I would suggest that basic animal companionship is not manipulation. It is a recognized therapeutic tool used in hospitals, schools, and yes, courtrooms, to help traumatized individuals regulate their nervous systems. The child is more calm now than she has been all day. That serves the interests of justice, as a calm child is more likely to process information accurately and potentially communicate if she chooses to do so." She turned her attention back to the proceedings. "We will continue with testimony, but Officer Bella will remain in the courtroom. If the child's anxiety levels begin to increase noticeably, we will take another brief recess. This ruling was a subtle but significant shift in the courtroom dynamics. The judge had acknowledged the dog's therapeutic value and legitimized its presence as a tool for the child's well-being. More importantly, she had signaled to everyone in the room that she was paying close attention to Maya's psychological state, not just the legal arguments being presented. The afternoon testimony continued. Social workers described the apartment conditions, the evidence of domestic disturbance, the signs of neglect. A physician testified about the injuries she'd treated on Sarah's body over the years, a fractured rib, a concussion, repeated contusions consistent with intimate partner violence. With each testimony, the clinical evidence of abuse accumulated, creating an alternative narrative to Derek's story of redemption. But without Maya's voice, it remained a narrative told by adults about adult observations. It lacked the immediacy, the credibility, the emotional resonance of a child's own account. As the afternoon wore on, Maya occasionally reached down to touch Bella, to run her fingers through the dog's soft fur. Each time she did so, her breathing seemed to slow, her shoulders to relax further. She was establishing a pattern of self-regulation, learning that she could access calm through connection with the dog, that there was an external resource available to help her manage her overwhelming internal states. By the time Judge Morrison called for a brief 15-minute recess at 4:30, the entire atmosphere of the courtroom had shifted. The morning sense of Derek's momentum had dissipated. The judge's attention had clearly moved from evaluating his redemption narrative to evaluating the evidence of his daughter's trauma. During the recess, something extraordinary happened in the hallway outside the courtroom. Maya, still accompanied by Bella, was walking slowly toward the water fountain with her mother. As they passed Derek's side of the hallway, where Derek stood with his legal team, Maya suddenly stopped. Her hand, which had been resting on Bella's collar, began to tremble. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart, we're safe." For a moment it seemed as though Maya might speak. Her lips parted. A small sound began to emerge from her throat, not quite words but not quite silence either. It was the sound of a voice beginning to find its way back into existence, like a person surfacing from deep underwater and taking their first gasping breath. But then Derek turned and looked at his daughter, and his expression, one of confusion mixed with something harder, something angry, caused the fragile moment to shatter. Maya's mouth closed. Her hand gripped Bella's collar more tightly. The moment passed. But something had changed. A door had opened, even if just slightly. A voice that had been silent for 8 months had begun to remember how to speak. And Judge Morrison, who had observed the entire interaction from across the hallway, made another note in her file. The judge understood now that the proceedings were moving toward something significant, something that the attorneys and their carefully constructed arguments could not control. A child was finding her way back to voice, and when she did, everything would change. The courtroom felt different when proceedings resumed at 4:45. The light had shifted again, the afternoon sun now casting longer shadows across the polished floor. Judge Morrison settled back into her chair with a sense of purpose that hadn't been present that morning. She'd observed something in the hallway during the recess, something that had confirmed her instincts about this case. She was a judge who trusted the totality of circumstances, not just the documentary evidence or the testimony of adults. And the totality of what she was witnessing suggested that a child's voice was trying to emerge. Margaret DeLuca had one final witness to call, Sarah Thompson herself. Derek's legal team had been bracing for this testimony, knowing that Sarah would describe the years of abuse, the fear, the incidents that had prompted her to finally leave. But they also knew that without Maya's corroboration, Sarah's testimony could be characterized as biased, as the words of an angry ex-wife seeking to punish her former husband. Sarah took the witness stand with visible anxiety. Her hands shook as she was sworn in, her voice trembling as she answered DeLuca's initial questions. She described meeting Derek years earlier when he was charming and attentive. She described the gradual escalation of his drinking, his mood swings, his anger. She spoke about incidents, a lamp thrown against a wall, a fist driven through a cabinet door, verbal tirades that lasted hours, nights spent locked in the bathroom with Maya, trying to keep her daughter safe and calm while their father raged in the adjacent rooms. "Did you ever try to leave?" DeLuca asked gently. "Many times," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "But he'd threatened to take Maya away from me. He said he had connections, that he'd convince a judge that I was unstable, that he'd get full custody. I was terrified of losing her, so I stayed. I thought if I stayed, if I managed his moods carefully, if I was a good enough wife, things would get better. But they didn't get better. No, they got worse. Last year he was drinking heavily every night. The rage seemed to come more easily. One night he threw a glass at me. It cut my arm, and Maya saw all of it. She was standing in the doorway of her bedroom watching, and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't let her grow up thinking that's what love looks like, what marriage looks like, what a father is supposed to be." It was powerful testimony, the kind that made people in the gallery shift uncomfortably, that made the judge lean forward slightly with attention. But Harrison Blackwell's cross-examination was equally powerful in a different way. "Ms. Thompson," he began, his tone suggesting reasonable skepticism, "you've described a very dark picture of my client. Yet according to the police records, you called law enforcement on only 2 occasions during your entire marriage. If things were truly as severe as you're describing, wouldn't you have called more frequently?" "I was afraid," Sarah replied. "I didn't want the police involved because I was afraid of losing Maya." "So you didn't actually report most of the incidents you're now describing to this court?" "No." "Which means the only documentation of these alleged incidents is your own recollection. And the bruises and the ER visits, the doctor documented." "The doctors documented injuries, yes, but they didn't witness the circumstances that caused those injuries, did they? You simply told them you'd had an accident or fallen or walked into a door. Isn't that correct?" "I was protecting him. I was ashamed." "So again, we're relying on your interpretation of events, your memory, your characterization of my client. Is that fair?" By the time Blackwell finished, he'd managed to cast Sarah's testimony as the unreliable recollections of a woman with an obvious bias against her ex-husband. It was subtle but effective, not denying that injuries had occurred, but suggesting that Sarah's interpretation of their cause might be colored by anger and resentment. Judge Morrison listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She was good at maintaining neutrality, at not telegraphing her thinking through facial expressions or body language. But her eyes kept drifting toward Maya, toward the small child who sat silently in her chair, occasionally touching the golden dog beside her. At 5:15, as the afternoon was drawing to a close and everyone was growing tired, Judge Morrison made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the entire case. "I think we need to take a different approach," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "We have heard from adults about their perceptions of events. We have heard testimony about programs completed, recovery achieved, abuse alleged. But the person who has the most direct knowledge of the environment in which she lives, the person whose well-being is at stake, remains silent. I want to explore whether there is any way to help this child communicate." She turned to Officer Chen. "Officer, I understand that Bella has been trained to work with traumatized children. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Officer Chen replied. "She's been certified in therapeutic animal work and has participated in numerous cases involving traumatized children." "And in your professional experience, have you observed animals helping children communicate who might otherwise remain silent?" "I have, Your Honor. Not every time, and not in a way that necessarily produces verbal testimony suitable for a courtroom. But animals can help children regulate their nervous systems, can help them feel safe enough to begin processing trauma. Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "What I'm about to do is highly unusual," she said, addressing the entire courtroom. "And I want to be clear that I'm doing this in the interest of the child's well-being and the court's ability to understand what she has experienced. I'm going to request that the child be allowed some quiet time with the therapy dog, away from the formal courtroom setting, but with appropriate supervision. Ms. Thompson, Dr. Chen, Officer Chen, and I will adjourn to my chambers. The attorneys for both sides will observe via video feed. The child's well-being is the only concern here." Blackwell stood to object, but Judge Morrison raised her hand. "Your objection is noted. However, I am the judge in this courtroom, and I have the discretion to take measures that I believe serve the interests of justice and the child's well-being. This child has been through enough trauma without being forced to perform her distress in a formal courtroom setting. We will adjourn to chambers." What followed was one of the most unusual 30 minutes in the history of that courthouse. In Judge Morrison's private chambers, a warmer, more human space than the courtroom, with bookshelves and comfortable chairs, Maya sat on a soft carpet with Bella beside her. Dr. Chen sat nearby but not hovering. Officer Chen was present but unobtrusive. Judge Morrison sat in a comfortable chair, her demeanor noticeably different from her stern judicial bearing, still authoritative but more grandmotherly, less intimidating. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, her hand resting gently on Maya's back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're safe here, if you want to talk, I'm listening. Bella's listening. Everyone here is listening because we care about you." For several minutes, nothing happened. Maya petted Bella, the dog's presence a solid anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Then, very slowly, Maya looked up at her mother. Her mouth opened. A small sound emerged, not quite a word, but the beginning of speech. "Safe?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper, a voice that had been silent for 8 months finally finding its way back into existence. "Yes, baby," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe." Then Maya turned slightly, looking toward Judge Morrison, and spoke again, her voice slightly stronger. "Bella's safe." "Yes," Judge Morrison said gently, "Bella is very safe, and so are you." Maya's small hand gripped Bella's collar more tightly. And then, in a moment that would be replayed in legal circles for years to come, Maya pointed toward the video screen where Derek's image appeared, watching from the courtroom. Maya said, her voice trembling but clear, "He hurt Doggy." The room seemed to stop breathing. He scared Bella, he scared Mommy, he scared Maya. It was a child's version of events, fragmented and simple, but unmistakable in its meaning. A voice that had been silent for 8 months had spoken truth that no amount of legal argument, professional testimony, or redemption narrative could contradict. Judge Morrison's expression hardened into something resolute and final. In that moment, in that warm, book-lined chambers with a frightened child and a loyal dog, justice began to take its true shape. The video feed cut off. Judge Morrison had made a decisive gesture, instructing the bailiff to disconnect the monitor that allowed Derek and his legal team to observe from the courtroom. Whatever was about to unfold in her chambers would not be performed for an audience. This was not a courtroom proceeding anymore. This was a child finding her voice, and that voice deserved to be heard in safety, without the intimidating presence of the person she feared watching through a camera lens. Dr. Meredith Chen sat with her notebook and pen, her professional demeanor giving way to something more human, more moved. She had worked with traumatized children for 30 years, and she had learned to recognize the moment when a breakthrough occurs, that delicate instant when a child's nervous system finally determines that it is safe enough to speak, that the threat has diminished sufficiently to allow voice to emerge from silence. Maya sat on the carpet with Bella's head resting on her lap. The dog seemed to understand the significance of the moment, maintaining her calm presence while the child gathered the courage to continue speaking. Each word seemed to cost Maya tremendous effort, as if her throat had to relearn the mechanics of producing speech. "Can you tell me more about what happened?" Judge Morrison asked gently, her tone completely devoid of the judicial authority that had characterized her courtroom demeanor. "Take your time. There's no rush." Maya was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers working through Bella's fur in repetitive motions, a self-soothing gesture that Dr. Chen recognized as Maya regulating her nervous system through tactile input. "Daddy was mad," Maya began haltingly. "Daddy was always mad. He yelled. He yelled at Mommy. He yelled at me." Sarah's hand moved to her daughter's back, providing silent reassurance without interrupting. "One day," Maya continued, her voice gaining slightly more strength as she spoke, "there was a dog. The neighbor's dog. It was nice. It came to our yard. And Daddy saw it and he got really, really mad. He said bad words." Dr. Chen was taking notes, documenting not just the content of what Maya was saying, but the emotional tenor, the way the child's body language shifted as she accessed different memories. "What did your daddy do when he saw the dog?" Judge Morrison asked, her voice steady and encouraging. He kicked it," Maya said, and her voice began to shake. "The dog ran away, but Daddy was still mad. He kept yelling. He said the dog was stupid and annoying and nobody wanted it." Sarah felt her heart breaking anew, recognizing that Derek's violence extended not just to her and their daughter, but to innocent animals as well, a behavior pattern that psychologists recognized as a significant indicator of broader violent tendencies. "And then what happened?" Judge Morrison prompted gently. "Then he came inside and he was still mad," Maya continued. "And he yelled at Mommy that everything was her fault, that she was stupid, that she didn't keep the house right and that's why the dog came. He threw a glass. I remember the glass breaking. It was loud." Officer Chen listened carefully. This account aligned precisely with the incident Sarah had described in her testimony, the one that had finally prompted her to leave Derek. The glass that had cut her arm, that had sent her daughter into trauma so severe she'd stopped speaking entirely. "Where were you when your daddy threw the glass?" Judge Morrison asked. "In my room," Maya said, "but I could hear it, and I could hear Mommy crying, and I was scared Daddy would hurt her. I was scared Daddy would hurt me." The room was absolutely silent, except for Maya's small voice and the occasional sound of her breathing. "Did your daddy ever hurt you?" the judge asked, her tone becoming even more careful, even more gentle. Maya was quiet for a long time. She looked down at Bella, and the dog's presence seemed to give her courage. Not like he hurt Mommy," Maya finally said, "but he scared me. He yelled really loud right in my face sometimes. He said if I told anyone about the things he did, he'd take me away from Mommy and I'd never see her again. He said nobody would believe me. He said I was just a stupid little baby." Dr. Chen made a note. Emotional abuse, threats of parental alienation, isolation tactics, gaslighting, all recognized forms of child maltreatment that, while not involving physical violence, caused deep psychological damage. "Maya," Judge Morrison said, "I want to ask you something important. Your daddy has been saying that he's changed, that he's better now. Do you think that's true?" Maya shook her head emphatically, one of the few clear, decisive gestures she'd made since beginning to speak. "No," she said firmly. "He's still mean. When Mommy had to take me to see him at the supervised place, he got mad because I didn't want to hug him. He said I was being disrespectful. He said Mommy had turned me against him." "Did he ever say sorry for the things he did?" the judge asked. "No," Maya replied. "He said it was Mommy's fault for making him mad." This was perhaps the most damning testimony yet, not because of what Maya was describing, but because of what she was revealing about Derek's fundamental inability to take responsibility, his tendency to externalize blame, his lack of genuine remorse. A man who truly was in recovery would acknowledge his actions and apologize. Derek had done neither in his interactions with his daughter. Dr. Chen recognized the pattern clearly. This was not a man who had undergone genuine psychological transformation. This was a man who had learned the language of recovery, the programs, the certificates, the professional letters, without actually changing the underlying beliefs and behaviors that had caused harm in the first place. "Why did you stop talking?" Judge Morrison asked gently. "When did you decide not to speak?" Maya was quiet again. Her fingers continued to work through Bella's fur, and the dog's patience was unwavering. "I got scared," Maya finally said. "Scared that if I said anything about Daddy, he would take me away. Scared that Mommy would get hurt worse. Scared that nobody would help." "But now you're talking," Judge Morrison observed. "Why now? What changed?" Maya looked at Bella, then at her mother, then at Judge Morrison. "Bella," she said simply, "Bella is not scared of Daddy. Bella is just nice, and she listens. And when I pet her, I don't feel so scared anymore." In that moment, Judge Morrison understood something profound about trauma, about healing, and about the limitations of human expertise when confronted with a child's need for safety and unconditional acceptance. Bella had succeeded where trained psychologists had failed, not because she possessed superior clinical knowledge, but because she offered something simpler and more powerful: presence without judgment, acceptance without condition, loyalty without demand. "Thank you for being so brave," Judge Morrison said to Maya. "Thank you for telling me what happened. You were very brave." Maya nodded, and for the first time something almost resembling relief crossed her small face. She had spoken. She had told the truth. And the world hadn't ended. Her father hadn't magically appeared to punish her. Her mother hadn't disappeared. She was still safe. Sarah pulled her daughter close, and Maya allowed it, leaning into her mother's embrace with a trust that had been absent for 8 months. Dr. Chen made final notes in her file, noting not just the content of Maya's statements but the physiological changes she was observing. Lowered heart rate, relaxed shoulders, the beginning of genuine emotional processing rather than the frozen shutdown that had characterized her behavior for so long. Judge Morrison sat back in her chair, her judicial mind already formulating the legal framework for her ruling. She had heard from a child who had been afraid to speak, who had been silenced by threat and fear, who had retreated into protective mutism when faced with an environment she perceived as dangerous. And that child had spoken truth. The legal standards were clear. The judge had witnessed firsthand a child's account of emotional abuse, of threats, of an environment characterized by violence and fear. She had observed the child's distress, her fear responses when discussing the father, her clear preference for safety with her mother. Derek Thompson had come to court believing that his recovery narrative would prevail, that documentation of completed programs would outweigh a silent child's lack of testimony. He had not anticipated that the child would find her voice, that a therapy dog would facilitate a breakthrough his own daughter's therapist had been unable to achieve, that his own daughter would reveal the hollowness of his redemption story. In her chambers, Judge Morrison began to formulate a ruling that would protect a child, that would prioritize her safety and healing over a father's desire for access, that would recognize that redemption is not a certificate completed or a program finished, but a fundamental change in how one treats the people one claims to love. The truth had emerged, and it would change everything. The courtroom was silent as Judge Morrison entered, her expression grave and resolved. It was 6:47 p.m., far later than any of them had anticipated being in court that day. The late afternoon sun had given way to early evening, and the artificial lighting of the courtroom seemed harsher, more clinical than it had that morning. Derek sat with Harrison Blackwell, and even the attorney's usual confidence had evaporated. He'd watched the video feed get disconnected, had listened to the bailiff's vague report that the child has begun communicating, and had understood immediately that his carefully constructed narrative had been undermined by the one testimony he'd believed impossible: his own daughter's voice. Sarah sat with Margaret DeLuca, her hand still trembling slightly from the emotional intensity of the afternoon. Maya sat in her chair, but something fundamental had changed about her demeanor. She was no longer frozen. Her eyes were present, aware, engaged with the world around her rather than retreated into some internal fortress of protection. Judge Morrison settled into her chair with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she was about to deliver something momentous. She removed her glasses and set them carefully on the bench before her, a gesture that seemed to shed her formal judicial armor. "This has been an extraordinarily difficult case," she began, her voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion beneath the professional tone. "I have listened to testimony from multiple perspectives. I have reviewed extensive documentation. I have considered the complex dynamics of custody, rehabilitation, and parental rights. But what I witnessed this afternoon in my chambers has clarified, for me, what the central issue in this case truly is." She paused, letting the courtroom absorb her words. "A 3-year-old child stopped speaking 8 months ago. Clinical professionals have spent hundreds of hours attempting to understand why, to help her overcome her selective mutism, to create conditions in which she might communicate. All of those efforts, well-intentioned and professionally competent, were unsuccessful. Yet this afternoon, in the presence of a therapy animal and her mother, that child found her voice. And the words she spoke revealed something that no amount of adult testimony, no volume of documentary evidence, could have conveyed with equal power. The perspective of a child who has experienced fear, who has witnessed violence, and who has internalized the belief that speaking about those experiences would result in catastrophic consequences. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Blackwell's hand moved to his arm, a subtle gesture counseling restraint. "The child's account of events," Judge Morrison continued, "corroborates her mother's testimony regarding specific incidents. More importantly, her account reveals something about the environment in the home that transcends the specific incidents. It reveals a pattern of intimidation, of fear, of a child who believed that her own safety and her mother's safety depended upon her silence." The judge picked her glasses back up and placed them on her nose, resuming her formal demeanor. "I have also observed something significant about Mr. Thompson's response to his daughter's initial communication. Rather than demonstrating genuine concern for his daughter's well-being, rather than asking how he can help her heal from her trauma, Mr. Thompson's response, as reported by the bailiff, was to express frustration that the child was turning against him. This response is inconsistent with genuine rehabilitation. It is consistent with a man who views his daughter not as a vulnerable child in need of protection and healing, but as a possession, a status symbol, a way to maintain control." Blackwell stood to object, but the judge raised her hand. "I am not finished, counsel. You will have opportunity to respond, but I will finish my remarks first." She turned her full attention to Derek. "Mr. Thompson, you have presented to this court a narrative of redemption. You have documented completion of programs. You have provided letters of recommendation. But you have not addressed the fundamental issue, whether you have the capacity to prioritize your daughter's well-being above your own pride, your own need for control, your own desire to win. The evidence suggests you do not." The courtroom was absolutely still. Nobody moved. The judge's words seemed to hang in the air like a verdict already rendered. "However," Judge Morrison continued, "I want to be clear about something. I am not ruling today that Mr. Thompson is irredeemable. I am not suggesting that he will never have a relationship with his daughter. What I am ruling is that at this moment, in this time, with the evidence before me, the child's safety and healing must be the paramount concern. And the child has made clear, through her behavior, through her words, through her presence with her mother, that she needs safety, distance, and healing before any relationship with her father can be reestablished." She opened the file before her and began to read her written ruling into the record. "It is hereby ordered that full legal and physical custody of Maya Elizabeth Thompson is awarded to her mother, Sarah Thompson. Mr. Derek Thompson is granted supervised visitation only, to be conducted by a court-approved supervisor at a neutral location, no more than 2 hours per week, contingent upon the following conditions. First, Mr. Thompson must complete a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation by a licensed professional to assess for personality disorders, anger management issues, and capacity for genuine behavioral change. Second, Mr. Thompson must engage in individual psychotherapy, not anger management classes, but genuine psychological treatment addressing his patterns of control, his lack of genuine remorse, and his tendency to externalize responsibility for his actions. Third, any violations of visitation conditions, any attempts to contact the child outside of supervised settings, any communications with the child designed to undermine her relationship with her mother, will result in immediate revocation of visitation rights. Fourth, before any unsupervised visitation can be considered, at minimum 2 years must pass, during which time Mr. Thompson must demonstrate consistent engagement in therapy, must provide evidence of genuine psychological change, and must submit to evaluations confirming that such change has occurred. And fifth, any decision to increase Mr. Thompson's access to his daughter must be made in consultation with the child's therapist and must include the child's own input regarding her comfort level with increased contact. Judge Morrison looked directly at Derek. Mr. Thompson, I want you to understand that this ruling is not punishment, it is protection. Your daughter needs to heal. She needs to learn that she is safe, that her mother will protect her, that she can speak her truth without catastrophic consequences. Your presence in her life at this moment is an obstacle to that healing, not a facilitator of it. That may change in the future, but today her healing is the priority. Then the judge turned to Sarah. Ms. Thompson, you are the custodial parent. I commend your courage in leaving a dangerous situation, in prioritizing your daughter's safety over your own comfort, in seeking protection through the legal system. You have the responsibility now to facilitate your daughter's healing. This means continued work with her therapist, continued support for her emotional processing of the trauma she has experienced, and patience as she reintegrates her voice into her life. Finally, Judge Morrison looked at Maya. Maya, I want to tell you something, and I want you to remember this. You were very brave today. You told the truth. You used your voice. And because you did, I can make sure you stay safe with your mother. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Your job now is just to be a little girl, to play, to laugh, to grow. The adults around you will take care of keeping you safe. Maya watched the judge with the intensity of a child trying to absorb something crucial. She reached down and touched Bella, who had been present throughout the entire proceeding, lying calmly near her chair. The ruling was complete. Derek had lost, not because he hadn't rehabilitated himself, not because he hadn't completed programs, but because he had fundamentally failed to prioritize his daughter's well-being, because his response to her trauma had been narcissistic rather than parental, because his need for control had superseded his capacity for genuine love. As the court adjourned, Sarah pulled Maya into her arms, and this time the child clung to her mother with a desperation born of relief. She had spoken. She had been believed. She was safe. Over the following weeks, something remarkable occurred. With the immediate threat of her father removed, with the legal system confirming that her mother would protect her, Maya began to genuinely heal. Her selective mutism resolved not through clinical intervention, but through the simple restoration of safety. She began to speak more, to laugh, to ask questions, to process her experiences in age-appropriate ways. Dr. Chen continued working with her, but the focus shifted from trying to unlock communication to helping a child integrate her traumatic experiences into a coherent narrative of survival and resilience. The dog, Bella, became a regular presence in their home through a community therapy program, visiting twice weekly to reinforce Maya's sense of safety and her emerging ability to trust. Sarah attended support groups for survivors of domestic violence. She worked with her own therapist to process the years of fear and control she had endured, to rebuild her sense of self, to heal her own trauma. She discovered that healing was not a destination but a process, that moving forward didn't mean forgetting, but learning to carry memories without being crushed by them. The case became a landmark in family law, cited in subsequent custody proceedings as an example of how a child's own communication, when properly facilitated and supported, provides crucial information that no amount of adult testimony can replicate. Legal scholars wrote about it. Therapists discussed it in continuing education courses. It became a reminder that sometimes the wisdom of our institutions needs to be tempered by the wisdom of our hearts, and sometimes a therapy dog can accomplish what years of clinical expertise cannot. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in Judge Morrison's courtroom. The community center in Pittsburgh's Shadyside neighborhood was decorated with ribbons and balloons in gold and blue, the colors of the police department's K-9 unit. Tables had been arranged in a semicircle, and a small stage had been constructed for the ceremony that was about to take place. Approximately 200 people had gathered: police officers, social workers, child psychologists, judges, journalists, and community members who had heard about the case that had captivated the region. At the center of it all was Maya, now 4 years old, holding a golden medal on a ribbon. She stood beside Officer James Chen and Bella, whose own medal hung prominently around the dog's neck. The transformation in Maya over those 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. She wore a pale yellow dress, her blonde hair adorned with fresh flowers rather than ribbons. More importantly, she stood with the posture of a child who had reclaimed her sense of safety, who had learned that her voice mattered, who understood that the adults in her world were committed to protecting her rather than harming her. "Ladies and gentlemen," the police commissioner began, his voice carrying across the community center, "we gather today to honor an extraordinary animal, Officer Bella of the Pittsburgh Police Department K-9 unit. But more importantly, we gather to celebrate a child's courage and resilience." Sarah sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Next to her was her mother, whose own tears reflected the pride and relief of a grandmother who had watched her granddaughter emerge from darkness into light. Behind them sat Dr. Meredith Chen, Margaret DeLuca, and Judge Patricia Morrison, who had taken time away from her docket to attend this ceremony. "Officer Bella," the commissioner continued, "has served our community for 3 years in various capacities. She has assisted in drug detection, in disaster response, and in therapeutic interventions. But her most significant contribution may be what occurred in Judge Morrison's courtroom 6 months ago, when her presence and her calm, non-judgmental companionship helped a traumatized child find her voice. When scientific expertise had reached its limits, when professional intervention had failed to achieve breakthrough, a dog's pure, unconditional love succeeded where everything else had fallen short." The audience applauded. Officer Chen's eyes glistened with emotion. Bella's tail wagged, though she remained seated in the calm, professional manner she had been trained to maintain in public settings. "We are here today," the commissioner said, "to present Officer Bella with the Community Service Medal, the highest honor we can bestow upon a non-human member of our force. But we are also here to celebrate something equally important: the triumph of a child who refused to remain silent, even when silence seemed like her only safe choice." The commissioner turned to Maya. "Maya, would you like to say something?" Maya looked up at her mother, who nodded encouragement. The child approached the microphone, which had been specially lowered for her height. She stood on a small step stool so she could reach it, and the audience fell into a respectful silence. "Hi," Maya said, her voice clear and strong, a voice that 6 months earlier no one believed would ever speak. "I'm Maya. I want to say thank you to Bella." The simplicity of the statement was devastating in its power. An entire room of adults, professionals, judges, law enforcement officers, was moved to tears by a 4-year-old thanking a dog for helping her find her courage. When I was scared, Maya continued, choosing her words carefully the way children do when they're concentrating hard on communication, Bella was not scared. Bella was just nice. She didn't ask me questions. She didn't make me talk. She just was there. And that made me feel safe. Judge Morrison leaned forward, listening intently to the child whose case she had presided over, whose voice she had helped unlock. I was scared for a long time, Maya said. I didn't want to talk because I thought bad things would happen, but Bella taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing things even when you are scared, like talking, like telling the truth. She paused, and in that pause was the emotional weight of a child processing trauma, finding language for experiences that transcended her years. Now I'm not scared anymore, Maya said. Now I know my mommy will keep me safe. Now I know that when I talk, people listen. Now I know that brave people and brave dogs can help you find your voice. The audience erupted in applause. Sarah was openly sobbing, her mother's arm around her shoulders. Even Judge Morrison, who prided herself on judicial composure, wiped away tears. Maya walked to Bella and hugged the dog's neck. Bella remained perfectly still, allowing the child to embrace her, understanding somehow that this moment was sacred, that this was a child reclaiming herself, that this was healing made visible. Over the following hour, speakers shared stories about the case, about trauma, about recovery, about the unexpected ways healing can occur. Officer Chen spoke about Bella's training and her natural gift for recognizing distressed children. Dr. Chen spoke about the limits of clinical psychology when confronted with severe trauma, and about the power of environmental factors, safety, trust, non-judgmental presence, in facilitating healing. Margaret DeLuca spoke about the importance of vigorous legal advocacy for vulnerable populations. And Judge Morrison spoke about justice, about how true justice requires not just legal judgment but compassion, creativity, and willingness to step outside traditional frameworks when a child's well-being is at stake. The ceremony concluded with Maya officially presenting Bella with her medal, guided by Officer Chen, but doing most of the work herself. As the medal settled around Bella's neck, the dog seemed to understand the significance, standing with particular dignity, her tail wagging with unmistakable pride. After the ceremony, at a reception held in an adjacent room, Maya moved through the crowd with remarkable confidence, greeting people, accepting congratulations, demonstrating the social ease of a child who had reclaimed her sense of safety and belonging. She would occasionally reach down to touch Bella, who remained at her side throughout the event, a constant reassuring presence. Judge Morrison approached Sarah and knelt slightly to be at eye level with Maya. "I'm so proud of you," she said to the child. "You've done something really important. You've shown the world what bravery looks like." Maya smiled. "Bella showed me," she said simply. Judge Morrison looked at Sarah. "And you," she said to the mother, "have done something equally important. You've created an environment where your daughter can heal, where she can grow, where she can become who she's meant to be. That's the work of a true mother." Sarah embraced the judge, years of tension and fear releasing in that single gesture. The weeks and months that followed saw Maya continue to flourish. She started preschool, where she made friends, where she participated enthusiastically in activities, where teachers commented on her remarkable resilience and kindness toward other children. She continued therapy with Dr. Chen, but the focus had shifted from treatment of pathology to processing of experience, from clinical intervention to emotional development. The supervised visitation with Derek had begun as ordered by the court, but Derek's behavior during those visits had been telling. He remained defensive, continued to blame Sarah for poisoning his daughter against him, showed little genuine interest in Maya's emotional well-being or her experiences. After 3 months, Derek stopped showing up for his scheduled visits. His attorney filed paperwork indicating that Derek was reassessing his priorities, and needed to postpone visitation temporarily. In reality, Derek had moved to Ohio for a job opportunity, and his lack of commitment to the difficult work of genuine change had become apparent. Maya noticed his absence, and Sarah addressed it with age-appropriate honesty. "Your daddy has decided he needs some time to work on himself," Sarah explained. "That's okay. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups need to take care of themselves." Maya accepted this with the wisdom of a child who had already learned that not all adults were capable of the kind of love and protection she deserved. It was a sad lesson, but it was also liberating. She was no longer waiting for her father to change, no longer hoping that his redemption would manifest, no longer invested in the fantasy that had kept her silent for 8 months. A year after the ceremony, the case was featured in a documentary about trauma and healing. Legal experts discussed its significance. Child psychologists cited it in academic papers about therapeutic interventions. The video of Maya hugging Bella went viral on social media, becoming an unlikely symbol of resilience and hope. But for Maya, the most important outcome was simpler and more profound. She grew up knowing that her voice mattered. She grew up understanding that speaking truth, even when it was difficult, even when it was frightening, was not just possible but necessary. She grew up with a mother who had fought for her, with a community that had supported her, with a therapy dog who had showed her that safety and unconditional love were possible. Bella continued her work with the police department, helping other traumatized children find their voices. She became something of a legend in law enforcement circles, the dog whose presence had changed a legal case, whose quiet companionship had unlocked what professional expertise could not. Years later, when Maya was in high school, she would write an essay for a school assignment about the person or animal who had most influenced her life. She wrote about Bella, about that day in the courtroom, about how a dog's simple presence had reminded her that even in the darkest moments, even when fear seemed overwhelming, there was always the possibility of safety, of voice, of hope. And somewhere in a retirement home for police dogs, Bella would live out her final years knowing that she had saved a child, had changed a legal precedent, had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful interventions in human affairs come not from expertise or authority, but from pure, unconditional love. The courtroom that had seemed so cold and intimidating on that morning 6 months earlier had become, through the presence of one remarkable dog, a place where a child had found her courage, where justice had been served not through legal maneuvering but through compassion, and where healing had begun. It was, in the end, a story about voice, about what it means to find it, to use it, to be heard. And it was a story that would be told and retold, inspiring others to speak their truth, to seek safety, to believe that even the deepest silence can be broken by love, by courage, and by the simple, extraordinary gift of being truly heard.